My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hi, it's Mark Bittman, host of Food with Mark Bittman. There are so many ways to save on quality items at Whole Foods Market every single day. So here's some hints for doing that coming into back-to-school season. 1. Check out the weekly sales at WholeFoodsMarket.com. Gets refreshed every Wednesday, so be sure to check then. 2. Remember to look for 365 by Whole Foods Market, snacks, salads, and more. 3, just walk the store and look for those little yellow signs that mention low price. There's one next to the responsibly farmed salmon right now in the seafood department. There are so many ways to save at Whole Foods Market, and now you know.
Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Tea called Investigates, a new series of episodes on the major stories we break at our newspaper. I'm Kamal Ahmed. After months of work, this episode with our investigations editor Claire Newell is about the BBC and a story of child sex abuse. Hear from the journalists who worked on the story and Alex, a victim who is speaking for the first time. It is a remarkable piece of work from the heart of our newsroom. And just to warn you, some of the content may be upsetting.
The BBC, one of Britain's best known and most trusted institutions. It's where many of us turn during major news events. But the corporation has occasionally become the news, particularly in relation to high-profile cases of paedophilia.
The former BBC presenter Huw Edwards has arrived at Westminster Magistrates Court.
As the counts of making indecent images of children were put to him, Mr. Edwards said calmly, guilty.
The evidence is now overwhelming that one of Britain's most beloved entertainers, the late Sir Jimmy Savile, was also a predatory sex offender.
Tonight, his family have announced they're taking down the headstone on his Scarborough grave.
There was a girl of about 14 sat on his knee.
But there have also been other cases of abuse. And now the BBC is facing fresh questions of whether it's done enough to protect children by properly vetting people coming to its offices or working on its behalf. In this special episode of the Daily Tea, we're broadcasting a previously untold story of child sexual abuse at the hands of someone working at the heart of the organisation. Welcome to the Daily Tea Investigates, with me, Claire Newell. So, as investigations editor at the Telegraph, I've got a team of reporters who spend quite a lot of time knocking on doors, calling people up and generally trying to get them to talk to us. But occasionally, people really want to speak. Daniel Foggo has come in to talk about a story that we've been doing together. He's a freelance investigative journalist. Dan, why don't you start by explaining how you heard about this story?
Well, I think it's one of those instances you've just referred to where someone really wants to speak out. In this case, it's a gentleman by the name of Alex Cook. Alex is a very intelligent, eloquent man who has reached pretty much near the top of his own profession, has had a very successful career, but he also has been burdened for most of his life with having been a victim of child sexual abuse. And the abuser was someone who'd actually worked indirectly for the BBC. This is back in the 1980s. And he reached out to a mutual friend and colleague of mine, and ultimately it ended up with me meeting him. And together we started digging into the details.
So he told you his story. What was the next step?
We wanted to know how it was that the man who'd abused him, his name is David Smith, now deceased, how he'd come to work indirectly for the BBC for quite some period of time, when it was obvious from the early stages that he was a compulsive and inveterate paedophile. So together we just went about piecing together what we knew, what we didn't know, and went from there.
That work eventually led to Alex coming in to talk to Dan and I. Alex had never spoken to the press before, so what you're about to hear is an untold story of child sexual abuse at the hands of someone working at the heart of the BBC. Over to Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Cook. I am 15, live in the West Midlands. I grew up in the southeast of England, not far from Gatwick Airport. Fairly rough upbringing. So as a child, I was fairly autonomous. I was out about on the streets a lot, looking after myself from quite a young age. My dad had remarried after my birth mother had left when I was very young. The second wife was alcoholic, abusive. So the family setup wasn't great. Not a place I wanted to spend a lot of time. I had not long turned 12. Coming into the summer months, decided that I could do with a bit of extra cash, so I was out car washing with a friend of mine. We'd been out for quite a few hours. We're just coming back down the A23 to get back to Hawley and home. And as we were passing a lay-by, Burgundy BMW pulled up.
Alex has a remarkable memory, and this moment is clearly seared on it.
Interesting number plate, BT 1200, caught the attention, and the guy, said, "Look, clearly you're washing cars. Do you want to come and do mine?" And we were like, "Yeah, looks like the guy's got some money." So sure enough, and he told us where he lived. It was a caravan park just down the A23 as you come into Hawley, which was a bit of a surprise. And we went round the back there and washed his car, and he paid us handsomely. Offered us a beer, which was unusual, but as a 12-year-old lad, quite a cool thing. And then said, "Look, do you want to come back and do the same next week?" And I said, "Yeah, why not?"
And what was your impression of him?
Pretty smooth, pretty warm, pretty kind, looked interested in us and what we were doing, was conversational. Yeah, he created an environment that kind of ticked all of the boxes. You feel safe, there's some fun, there's some alcohol. The guy's got a pretty cool job. He told us about the work that he was doing with the BBC. So yeah, it all seemed pretty good.
And what work did he do for the BBC?
He was a chauffeur, and at the time he was working predominantly on breakfast time, hence the number plate on the car. The way the role was described to me was that he would be sent out early in the morning to pick up the celebrities that were going to appear on the show, and some of the staff, I guess, as well.
Did that impress you?
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of think, BBC, that's cool,
And so, week after week, Alex went back to see the man with the car, whose name was David Smith.
So the friend that I had met Smith with initially didn't go back with me when I went back the following weekend. And I can't recall why, whether his parents didn't let him or... I went back, pretty much the same story. Washed the car, more conversation, more beer, and agreed that I would continue to go back.
And for how many months did that continue, going back on a Saturday?
Pretty much for the next 2 years. Yeah, so it all started so innocently. Of course, in my situation, that was a far more palatable environment to be in than home, and I didn't see any danger. So the car washing situation continued for, I don't know, weeks. But then things, started to get a bit more involved, shall we say.
That was when the abuse started. Smith would take Alex swimming.
He would use the pool in a way to touch me inappropriately. And I think for him it was a bit of a game because he was doing it in plain sight. I thought it was a bit weird, but I wasn't too put off by it. Was it accidental or not? Who knows?
Alcohol was a common feature of what Alex would only later realise was Smith's gradual grooming process.
We would go out for meals which again, you know, I'd never been to a restaurant before, so that was something interesting and exciting. He knew certain restaurant owners, so they were happy to serve me alcohol. I was 12, you know, and I was drinking when we were out like an adult, really.
Were you drunk, do you think?
Every single time. Yeah.
At times, there was another child there.
And Jason was a couple of years older than me. He was introduced to me as Smith's common-law son because I'd queried the fact that he was his son based on different surnames.
But he was abused too. He was also present when the worst of the abuse happened to Alex, at Smith's holiday home in Kent, where he would take the boys in the summer.
I'd been left to sleep on the sofa bed in the lounge, and unfortunately this time when I'm woken up, I'm being penetrated, I'm being raped.
Alex was so frightened, he ran outside. Jason followed him to see if he was okay.
I ran out of that chalet screaming my head off. I had no idea where I was going, what I was doing. I just ran and shouted. Behind the chalets was a field, it was dark. And at that point, Jason's caught up with me and he's telling me to calm down and he's offering me a cigarette. And he told me everything was okay, this is normal. And I remember saying, it's not, and we should talk to the police. And I remember saying that, which is so hard now, kind of looking back and thinking, fuck, I just made one different decision at that point. This probably would have been all okay. But when you're scared and you've got nowhere to go and it's dark, then it's pretty easy for you to get pulled back in.
Alex was 12 years old.
What happened with Jason? How long did he remain on that scene?
Only that summer, and it dissipated. Unfortunately, I became the focus of Smith's attention.
Alex describes Smith as someone who liked to take things close to the edge, which is presumably why he took him to work.
In terms of overtly leveraging his BBC connectivity, we went to TV Centre a couple of times, you know, the huge old building in White City. He had a pass, I remember that, so we went straight in. He was able to access studio areas. We went, I think it was downstairs to a studio. He liked, I think, parading, you know, and I kind of asked myself the question now, who was he showing me off to? We spent an inordinate amount of time in the canteen one day there.
And Smith didn't stop there. He even assaulted Alex at the BBC.
You know, indecent touching in the BBC studio, you know, where it was all a bit dark and cosy, that he was into that, yeah.
So he indecently assaulted you at the BBC television centre?
Yeah, in that TV studio.
And how old were you then?
12.
How many times do you think that happened?
What, at the BBC?
Yeah.
That's the one time that I remember. So it's weird, there are certain memories that are just very, very vivid, you know, and they appear like photographs. And being in a studio, it was, I think, probably the first time I've ever been in one. It was dark, it was small, it wasn't what I expected at all. And that just sits in my memory. And I remember that particular assault there. Could have happened other times, don't know.
Smith also took him to the office of Nien Cars, the chauffeur company where he worked. It was next door to the BBC's Lime Grove studios in West London, and it was run by a man called Nien Sinclair.
The other property, 35 Lime Grove, is where Nien Cars was based, who he worked for, and that was a property I visited a couple of times as well. And Niven was there behind a desk. Didn't really say much to me. He had a threatening kind of demeanour, fierce kind of demeanour, but I didn't feel particularly threatened at that time. He had a conversation with Smith and then I went, and that was it. It was really quite strange.
Alex found the interaction odd, but didn't think much more about it. Remember Sinclair's name, because we'll be coming back to him. The abuse by Smith continued for 2 years.
It just became a normal part of life. So I would see him most weekends. Being raped every weekend became totally normal because I didn't see it as rape, right? There were no violent struggles, yeah? It was just lie there and do what was required. That was a part of that existence. If you're going to go to nice restaurants, if you're going to go, see a show, if you're going to go and play sport, if you're going to go to the BBC, this is what comes along with it. And that, scarily, seemed a better proposition than the rest of my life at the time. So it went on until just shy of my 14th birthday. At that point, I was developing quite a keen interest in girls, probably because I was going through puberty, and the incongruence of the situation became very apparent. And the thing that I did, which I am most proud of anything I've done in my life, was turn around one day and say, no, this isn't happening anymore.
What did he say to that?
He was devastated. It was like a breakup for him. He was immediately sick, which I used as an opportunity to get my gear and get out of there.
Then, around a year later...
So I was 15, police come around, knocked on the door, Dad's answered it, come into the lounge, 2 police officers, hello Alex, got some questions to ask you. It would have lasted no more than 5-10 minutes tops. They had over 300 photographs of me that they'd taken from Smith's caravan. They weren't indecent. Majority of them were me playing football. They hadn't found the indecent ones and they hadn't found the videos. Otherwise, so again, something might have happened, but they simply asked me if he'd ever done anything inappropriate, if he was sexually abusing me. I remember being completely panicked and said nothing happened.
Alex bumped into Smith a few weeks later. The driver asked if he told the detectives anything. Alex said he hadn't. But then years later, when Alex was an adult, he did report the abuse to the police.
I turned 19 by this point, approached Surrey police, gave days worth of evidence interviews, and I gave them information about other friends of mine that Smith had approached. I gave very detailed evidence as to places we'd been. I talked specifically about the BBC, and I knew he worked for Nien Cars. I made it exceptionally clear that this was a man who was working on behalf of the BBC, and I mentioned the visits to White City.
But despite this, the police told him there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute.
He denied it, and it was basically he said, and they weren't going to take any further action.
And how did you feel about that?
Betrayed. I considered the evidence that I'd provided to be so bulletproof that I simply couldn't understand why it wasn't being pursued.
After that, Alex tried to bury what had happened.
I had a really difficult period in my life after that. Went to university and my world basically kind of imploded. Fortunately, over a period of about 3 years, I got my shit together and had met my wife and was living in Clapham, had got myself into a decent career. And then one day, 2001, I get a knock on the door, a chap called DC Dave Ellis, absolute hero.
The police were looking into allegations made by another man, the child Alex had cried to in the field, the boy who had handed him the cigarette, Jason. That child was now a man who had been to prison.
Jason, sadly, at the time, was going through some rehabilitation work at Belmarsh Prison. He'd made allegations. Ellis was investigating, and Ellis found out about me, and then he tracked me down and asked me if I knew anything about David Smith. So we were able to get hold of that evidence. I needed to update my statements, and Smith was investigated, interviewed and charged.
Smith was charged with offences from indecent assault to rape.
Next step, Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey. I remember being really quite excited, actually. You know, it was tough. My mental health was suffering again as a result of the proceedings, but I was on the right side of it, and I was fiercely determined. I was aware that Jason wasn't in such a strong mental position, but kind of felt that I could do what was required for the both of us. And then, to my utter astonishment, the CPS agreed a plea bargain.
Prosecutors dropped the more serious rape charge because Smith pleaded guilty to gross indecency and indecent assault. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Alex felt Smith had got off lightly.
Because as far as I was concerned, one, there's a very significant difference between gross indecency and rape when it comes to sentencing. You're looking twice as much.
Did you feel any satisfaction that he was going to prison?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this was a win, right? Without question, this was a win.
So Dan, when you and Alex first sit down, it's more than 20 years after that conviction. Clearly, Alex didn't feel that everything was resolved because he'd been doing some digging. And then I think you started working on things together. What did you find out?
Alex had done some research online. He'd seen something put online by a blogger saying that Smith had previous convictions going back some way back into the 1960s. And I wanted to try and see if we could verify those. So I went through various local newspaper archives, and what I have found is that Smith was definitely convicted in 1972 and given a 3-year term for abusing a number of boys, one of whom was as young as 9, for indecent assault. And he definitely had a previous conviction prior to that, we believe in 1966, for something similar. We think that he also committed further offences in the second half of the 70s.
So we don't know exactly when Smith started working for Nien Cars, that taxi company owned by that odd guy, Nien Sinclair. But we think it was at least 1984, long after those convictions for paedophilia.
So you think that those convictions would be a red flag to anyone who actually maybe bothered to do any vetting? We don't know whether that vetting was done.
Yeah, we don't know if any checks were done, and if they were done, what they found.
That's right.
Because it seems inconceivable that this kind of stuff wouldn't show up.
Yeah, I mean, this is back in the 1970s and 80s, and things are rather different now.
I guess the next question, Dan, is how long did he keep his job for? I think you spoke to somebody, a former driver at Nien Cars. What did they say?
Well, for starters, he remembered David Smith working there throughout the time he was there and even afterwards. So as a result of speaking to that person, I know that Smith was definitely still working for Nien Sinclair in 1991. I believe that he stopped working for him at some point in the 1990s.
But we don't have a specific date, and we've obviously asked the BBC.
And this driver also told me something else that was very important, which was that he was asked to ferry around young, unaccompanied children who were due to appear on a television programme. This was in the 80s. So what that tells us is that it wasn't unheard of for drivers for Nien Cars to be asked to drive around unaccompanied children. And we can only speculate as to how many unaccompanied children David Smith might have driven.
Yeah, it's definitely a cause for concern, isn't
Absolutely.
it? So if we think about that driver's testimony, that Smith was working for Nien Cars still in the early 90s, that makes the police investigation, which Alex told us about in 1989, really important.
Absolutely, because this is a police investigation and conviction, as we understand it, for child sex offences which happened while he was working for Nien Cars. And I did find this cutting, which is from the Hawley Mirror from August 1989.
So this says, a 43-year-old Hawley man has been charged with indecent assaults on children and has been remanded in custody. David Smith, 43, is accused of 5 indecent assaults against children under the age of 16, on one charge of gross indecency.
So he would have definitely disappeared from the office, at least for a while, and been unable to drive, and yet he retained his job.
So this abuse happened in the 1980s. What's changed since then at the BBC?
Well, legislation brought in at the end of the millennium means that the situation is very different now. So in 2002, the BBC brought in its first child protection policy, which has been reviewed and updated on occasion since then. But in essence, it says that children, when they're being transported, have to be accompanied by a parent or a guardian or a chaperone, unless in some exceptional circumstances they can just be driven unaccompanied, as long as they're with a BBC Transport approved taxi driver. And the way that it's phrased suggests that those taxi drivers will be checked, criminal records checked. So it seems far less likely that what happened then could happen now in terms of drivers with multiple convictions for abusing children being allowed to drive them around unaccompanied.
Coming up, Alex discovers that David Smith was not alone. There was another paedophile working right alongside him, also contracted as a BBC driver.
This summer, Instacart presents famous summer flavors coming to your front door. Or pool. Or hotel.
Your grocery delivery has arrived, sir.
That was faster than room service.
No violins in the lobby.
Oh, seriously? Anyway, sit back, relax, and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Starring your favorite snacks, drinks, and more. Download Instacart for free delivery on your first 3 orders. Rated H for hungry audiences. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum $10 per order. Excludes restaurants. Additional terms and fees apply.
Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Remember those trips to the swimming pool that Smith took Alex on, where some of the earliest abuse happened? Swimming pools were one of Smith's favourite grooming spots. And 2 years before Alex met him, the chauffeur had been abusing another child.
Lee Sullivan, and I'm aged 52. I used to go to in the school holidays, I used to go up to Lido with my friend Jason.
Jason, Smith's supposed common-law son.
I mean, I didn't come from a very well-off family. Money was a bit tight, so we used to sneak in to the Lido. Basically, there was some bent railings round the back, so we used to go in and just squeeze our bodies through and get in that way. There's a green area where you could sunbathe and whatnot, and we were just messing about, basically, running up and down, and I tripped. Well, I think back now, was I tripped or did I just trip over Smith's legs? I was unaware that Jason knew Smith before that event, but further down the line I found out Jason did know Smith, but he kind of acted as if they didn't know each other.
That thumping noise is Lee banging on the table. It's still a difficult subject for him to talk about. Just like with Alex, there was alcohol, also trips to a swimming pool, followed by more serious incidents.
Well, I remember it was my birthday, and basically that day is Smith raped me, basically.
And that was on your birthday?
Yeah.
How old were you on that day?
So I'm trying to think, it was either my 11th or 12th. I couldn't tell you over the course of time, it just started escalating and escalating. But yeah, it was just becoming more and more sort of like brazen all the time, and to the point where he just didn't care sort of who saw or anything.
Lee didn't pay much attention to what Smith did for a job, but he knew he was driven around in a car that referenced the BBC in its number plate.
I kind of deduced as we went on because of the license plate number he had, and the fact that I was in the car when he visited the BBC studios, and so I knew he had something to do with the BBC. What his actual job was at that time, I wouldn't have known, to be honest.
He only realised many years later when he read an article about Smith.
It just made sense to me. So, that's his job then. And it would explain all the BBC licence plates, and one of them, BBC 374 or something. That was a Silver Granada, I think. And yeah, because at the time, I mean, electric windows were a new thing, and it was like, oh my God, that's a top quality car if you don't have to use an handle to wind your windows down.
We've now heard what happened to Lee and Alex, but there's a third person that they've both mentioned, this boy called Jason. He died in 2015, but we were able to track down his relatives. They've asked us not to use their names or Jason's surname, but crucially, they've confirmed that Jason told them he was abused by David Smith, and that some of that abuse took place at the BBC, at Television Centre. They also told us that Smith worked as Jimmy Savile's driver. It all paints a picture of something that was happening repeatedly over the course of years. A lot has surprised us during this investigation: how Smith got the job driving for the BBC, how he kept that job even though he was convicted, and the sheer number of children he abused. But that isn't all of it. During the COVID pandemic, Alex started to wonder about Smith. He started looking online for answers.
So I started doing some investigations, found out some validating information about Nien Cars, dug more deeply, and what I was trying to understand was just how close David Smith, Nien Sinclair, other people associated with Sinclair were to victims and to some of these institutions. So that process of research unearthed quite a number of concerning facts. The most notable, of course, being the convictions that Nien Sinclair himself had for abusing young boys.
Nien Sinclair, the odd man that Alex met with Smith at the car company's office on Lime Grove.
The car company was formed and run by a convicted paedophile whose Court of Appeal documentation was in the public domain. You didn't have to look too hard to realise this guy was a bad one. He'd just come out of prison. He sets up a car company, gets a contract at the BBC, starts driving people around. BBC spent millions with a private hire firm who existed on an exclusive contract with News and Current Affairs for over 30 years.
Alex found documentation online which set out Sinclair's convictions. How did you feel when you saw that Sinclair had multiple convictions for child abuse?
I felt like, how the hell was he allowed to do this for so long with those convictions?
So Dan, do we have an answer to Alex's question? Why was Sinclair allowed to have this job and stay in it despite being a convicted paedophile?
Well, that's a really good question, because once you actually look at the detail, and it is there online, you can find it if you look hard enough, because Nien Sinclair appealed a lot of his sentences for child abuse, and the appeal court documents are online. And once you look at them, it really is eye-opening. In total, he had, by my count, 18 convictions, of which 15 were for child sex offences. These all predate his work for the BBC.
15 is a massive number, isn't it?
It is a huge number. A number of separate incidents spanning a decade from the early 60s to the early 70s, culminating in a 10-year sentence in 1971 for the multiple rapes of boys, even at gunpoint. This is what you would definitely describe as a recidivist and committed paedophile.
It really does seem extraordinary that his company was contracted to the BBC and he was driving BBC guests around.
Yes, but I mean, every inquiry that I've made has suggested that they thought he was great, the BBC, because he was very good at his job. I've spoken to a number of people who were relatively senior at that time in the 1980s, and they all say, he was really efficient at his job. And to that effect, actually, I also found this article online, which is still online and was first published in 2005 on the BBC's own website, in which they call him a hero, literally a hero for his work in getting people to appointments and appearances in the studio on time. And, he would drive the great and the good. It mentions here the former Prime Minister, Ted Heath, on one occasion. This article says, over the years, the wily and determined owner of Nivens has built a reputation for digging programmes out of holes. And it also says here that at that time, in 2005, he had 92 cars working around the clock for scores of programmes.
Let's go back to Alex now. I think it's safe to say that he's incredibly angry that it was possible for men like Smith and Sinclair to be contracted to work for the BBC.
So at the very least, the BBC have a responsibility to vet the companies and the company directors that they are dishing out big contracts to. At the very best, they would have processes wherein if those third-party contracts give people access that a BBC staff member might have, i.e. to members of talent, to buildings, to guests, to children, they should be subject to the same vetting processes of any BBC member of staff. Even back then, you're talking about a very significant publicly funded organisation. You're talking about a car service that works in the heart of news and current affairs that is responsible for taking the most high-profile politicians from the Palace of Westminster to BBC studios and elsewhere. They should have been vetted by the BBC, even back then.
We've asked the BBC what checks they did on Sinclair and Smith, what processes they had in place. They didn't respond to that question specifically. They did say, today's BBC has incredibly robust safeguarding policies and processes, which have been strengthened decade upon decade. If people have any complaints or concerns to put to us, we want to hear from them, and they will be treated with the utmost care and seriousness. They've previously said that they've not found a record of David Smith being employed by or working for the BBC.
Yeah, so it's really easy on the face of it to say, well, actually, David Smith was not employed by the BBC. Correct, he was employed by Nien Cars. Why did they have BBC passes? For all intents and purposes, they acted like employees. They certainly used the BBC name to assist them with earning money, and in my case and in the case of others that I know, as part of the grooming process. They had the same access as BBC employees. This wasn't a 6-month contract. This was decades. Decades.
As part of this investigation, we tried to find people who were abused by Sinclair while he was contracted to work for the BBC. Dan, what did you discover?
Well, yes, I did manage to track down and speak to one of the boys who he raped at gunpoint. This man, who's now in his 60s, was only 13 at the time. I was a little bit trepidatious about approaching him because you don't know whether people are going to want to talk about this or even remember it. I managed to catch him on his own, luckily, and he told me that he'd he pushed it so far back he'd never even told his wife about it. He'd buried it. So I think me turning up there wasn't overly welcome to him. He hadn't realised or known what Sinclair had gone on to do, but he did confirm to me that he raped him at gunpoint.
And then I think we're aware of other allegations that were made against Sinclair while he was at the BBC. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, so the driver that I spoke to remembers on a number of occasions going round to Sinclair's residence, which was immediately above the office that he had in Lime Grove. And this driver remembers turning up on a Sunday morning, particularly on one instance, but it happened a number of times, and seeing a young boy who he put at around the age of 10 coming down the stairs from Sinclair's living area, silent and white-faced and looking frankly terrified is how he put it. And when he asked Sinclair about what the boy was doing there, Sinclair said that he'd been doing a spot of babysitting, which this driver found absolutely extraordinary, because he said the last person you'd want ever babysitting anyone was Sinclair. He didn't know about his child sex convictions, but he was just referring to the fact that he had a monstrous temper. He said he was an absolutely irascible firework waiting to go off. And we are also aware of other allegations, more specific allegations about one young boy being raped by Sinclair at the tail end of the 80s, going into the early 90s.
That's important because at that point, Sinclair was running Nien Cars, which was contracted to the BBC.
Yes, and had been doing that for quite some time at that point, 15 years or more.
The BBC has faced several paedophilia scandals in recent years.
Today, the man who brought us the news for so many years was the news. Huw Edwards, surrounded by police, entered Westminster Magistrates Court, accused of accessing images of child abuse.
Last month, one of the broadcaster's most famous presenters pleaded guilty to possessing indecent images of children. But probably the thing we all remember is Jimmy Savile.
The evidence is now overwhelming that one of Britain's most beloved entertainers, the late Sir Jimmy Savile, was also a predatory sex offender. It's believed he abused young children over many decades, and 2 charities in his name have shut their doors.
After he died in 2011, it came out that Savile sexually abused hundreds of children and women at the height of his fame. For Lee, the resulting media coverage brought back memories that he had kept shut away of a BBC building seen from the back of Smith's car.
Because I was watching the Savile documentary. They showed a picture of the building from the exact same angle as where I was sitting in the car.
While Lee hadn't been taken inside the building like Alex, he'd sat outside the BBC with Smith, presumably when the chauffeur was between jobs.
And it was so accurate to what I remember. It's just like that was it. I was off, basically, because it was a mirror image of what I saw. And everything started flooding back. And because I know what's happened in the past to me, I wasn't about to just sit back and, oh, that's happening again. Ruining my life, basically. So seeing that picture actually got me going back to the police.
In 2012, Smith was arrested and charged with molesting and raping Lee. Because of the similarities between the cases, the detectives approached Alex.
And they asked me if I would be a prosecution witness, not to do with offences committed against me, but to corroborate the evidence. The principal reason for this was that Smith's grooming process and pattern was so common that my evidence would tie up very closely with the evidence and therefore help secure a conviction.
Alex agreed to help. The new investigation fell under Operation Yewtree, a nationwide police effort sparked by the Savile revelations. It was looking at allegations of sexual abuse against children, not just by the former BBC presenter, but also others.
I was really pleased. I thought, well, the whole story's going to come out now, and this is really good news. I remember contacting news desks back in 2002 when Smith was sentenced. And because it wasn't a police officer or a teacher or a politician, nobody was interested. I said, yeah, but the BBC's heavily involved here. not interested.
2 decades after he first reported Smith to the police, and nearly 30 years after the abuse started, Alex felt like the full story was finally about to come out.
And then the Tuesday morning, second morning of the trial anyway, got a phone call from one of the officers saying Smith had been found dead, suspected suicide.
How did you feel that he was dead?
Oh, delighted. Yeah, delighted, but really frustrated that that avenue for bringing out the full story. And bearing in mind, in my head at the time, the full story was more about the connectivity between Smith and the BBC and other potential victims. It's like another betrayal.
But for Lee, there was relief.
I don't know, there was a mixture, to be honest. I mean, there was part of me thinking, I'm glad he's dead. That's where he belongs and he can't hurt anyone else.
That was more than 10 years ago. But for Alex, this isn't over.
Every victim survivor story is different, but I think they all carry the same key characteristics. So there's trauma, and there's the recollection and the memories and the flashbacks that are associated with that trauma. Now, everyone's experienced sort of flashbacks. You get a memory, something triggers a smell or a sight or whatever. If every time that happens, you feel like someone's just stuck a dagger into your stomach and your adrenaline spikes something crazy, and just getting that time and time and time and time again, it's exhausting, it's distracting, it makes it much harder to continue on with a normal life than otherwise. And the way that I dealt with that was absolutely throwing myself into everything and trying to distract myself and just trying to be the best at whatever I was doing, whether that be work and career, whether it be family, whether it be running, you name it. I would try and do that to the best of my ability.
In many ways, Lee had a similar experience. The trauma affected the way he would respond to other people. What might seem normal to someone else could cause him to spiral.
I ruined a lot of relationships as well with, unbeknown to me at the time, now that was through trauma-based sort of things going on. It's because of the psychological damage that was done to me by his abuse is why a lot of my actions are trauma-based reactions, I dwell on something that most other people would find insignificant. I'd be dwelling on it for days and it just consumed me. Every job that I had, nearly every single job, I was sacked from, and it wasn't because of work effort or anything like that. It was coming in late and taking days off because my sleep pattern was all over the place. So I'd have night terrors, and a lot of this I'd never disclosed to anyone for years and years. I mean, waking up with like short breath and like your chest tight and basically you're having night terrors, and then you wake up in a state of anxiety, and then you feel like you're having a heart attack. Sometimes you can feel like you're actually physically dying.
At one point, things were so bad.
Like becoming homeless, losing my girlfriend, losing my job, all within the space of 2 weeks.
For Jason, the older boy who Lee and Alex both knew, the legacy of the abuse became too much to bear. He got caught up in drugs and ended up in prison. Lee remembers seeing desperate Facebook posts by him.
It's something along the lines of, I hate myself and, I wish I was dead, someone please come and kill me. But I didn't realise how serious it was. I mean, because I've said that before in the past about myself, not kind of absolutely meaning it at the time. Sometimes it's just like despair, I suppose.
Alex is keenly aware that it could have been him.
For me and Jason, yeah, absolutely feels like a sliding doors moment. Unfortunately, Jason went into a difficult life, mental illness, drugs, criminality, and sadly, I think 3 years after Yewtree, he committed suicide.
After his death, an inquest attributed Jason's state of mind to PTSD from the abuse by Smith. It's stories like this that makes Alex think the BBC still has questions to answer. That's why he's taking legal action.
I'm not seeking any personal damages. I don't think I've been fortunate. I've had a good life. So, it's purely punitive, really. As far as I'm concerned, I kind of had my justice when we got Smith jailed. I don't think the BBC have been held to account. I think there is an area that we know in law is very difficult around third-party contractors when it comes to negligence. What I hope to understand is whether or not the BBC have been negligent in the way that they have dealt with child sexual abuse, and particularly surrounding Nien Sinclair and Nien Cars and people that worked for him. Because I think there are a number of victims out there that haven't seen any form of justice whatsoever. I mean, including an apology. And there are other victims that have probably suffered through their lives as a result of the abuse they suffered, who should probably be compensated for that.
So Dan, we've heard a really powerful account from Alex. He's just told us he's preparing to take legal action against the BBC. What struck you personally about this story?
Well, we talked about 3 victims of Smith here, Alex, Lee and Jason. And it's very striking how in all 3 of those cases, the abuse that they suffered as children has just rippled out through their lives. But there were different outcomes. Jason took his own life. Lee's life has been blighted by dysfunctional work and personal relationships as a result of the abuse. And Alex, seemed to be really doing very well for himself until latterly when it all kind of imploded on him, and he's pulling it back now. It just goes to show how it's a real life sentence being subjected to this kind of abuse. And I think also in terms of the BBC, I think the BBC is very big on accountability and transparency. We don't know how many drivers there may have been similar to Smith and Sinclair working for Nien Cars. We don't know how many total victims there are. The BBC could, if they were motivated to do so, carry out their own investigation. Don't wait for a legal action to force your hand into going back through the records and the databases. They could get it on the front foot here and really proactively dig into this and reveal it. And I think that's what they should do.
They probably owe it to the victims to do that.
Absolutely.
Daniel Foggo, thank you for being with me in this first episode of the Daily Tea Investigates. We're going to keep following the story as it develops, but for now you can read the full story on the Telegraph website and in the newspaper. I'm Claire Newell. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Listen to this Acast show ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.